Welcome to the Compliance Officer's Playbook podcast. Today, we're diving into some breaking news. You know, for anyone doing business in or with Vietnam, it has to do with their evolving data regulations.
hmm
It's a legal alert, straight from February 2025. So buckle up.
Yeah, what's really interesting here is how Vietnam is trying to juggle like all these priorities at once. Obviously, they're trying to tighten national security and data control, but they're also,
Mm.
trying to fuel this booming digital economy. And they want to uphold, personal data protection as like a fundamental human right.
It's a tough balancing act, for sure. Okay, so let's break down what we know so far. We've got this landmark law on data, passed in November 2024.
Right. So this law, it basically lays the foundation for how digital data is managed and used and secured in Vietnam. And it
Sure,
actually
okay.
goes beyond just, theory. It mandates that they create a national data center and a national database. So it's a real commitment to improving how the government manages data and boosts transparency.
Yeah, it sounds like a pretty big deal. But then things get even more interesting in January 2025 with this wave of draft decrees. It's like
Yeah.
they released the instruction manual for how the law on data will actually work.
Yeah, exactly. They lay out all the specific rules. And, that's where our legal alert comes in. The biggest takeaway for businesses is that compliance is going to get stricter, especially for those that are handling what Vietnam classifies as core data and critical data. So this means new standards for data service providers, more clarity on sharing data with the Vietnamese authorities, and potentially, better data accessibility.
Okay, wait, hold on. Before we go any further, can we just define core data and critical data for our listeners? What falls under those categories?
Sure, think of it as like a hierarchy of data sensitivity. Core data relates to national security, the economy, public health, things with a significant impact. So imagine large-scale cross-border banking transactions or the health records of a huge percentage of the population.
Got it. Okay. And then what about critical data?
Critical data is even more sensitive. So that would include data that could seriously disrupt public order or national security if it were mishandled. Think like, detailed blueprints for critical infrastructure or the personal data of people in high-ranking government positions.
Wow, the stakes are high. What does all of this mean for businesses? Like, what are they going to have to DO differently?
Well, if a company handles core data or critical data, they're facing a lot stricter obligations. We're talking mandatory risk assessments, impact assessment reports, and if they want to transfer that data across borders, they'll need government approvals or at least notifications.
So that's going to cause some headaches,
Yeah.
especially for companies operating internationally.
Mm.
With tight deadlines, how long does this government review process actually take?
So for core data transfers, it's a 10-day review period,
Right.
while critical data is even faster, 5 days. So time is definitely a factor. And it's not just about the data itself, it's about the entire ecosystem of businesses that work with data. Data intermediaries, data analysis providers, data exchange platforms, they're all going to see some major changes.
Okay, let's break that down a little bit. I think most of our listeners are pretty familiar with data intermediaries. But what about these data analysis providers and data exchange platforms? What are they exactly, and what new rules are we talking about?
Sure. So data analysis providers are the companies that take raw data and turn it into, valuable insights. For businesses or research, the new regulations are particularly focused on those providers who are, doing really high-level analysis, like within critical national information systems. Think of the systems that manage like energy grids or financial markets or those who are using, national or specialized databases for their work. They're now going to need a special business eligibility certificate.
So that's a pretty big change. And then what about these data exchange platforms? This seems like a newer concept. What's the thinking behind regulating them?
It is relatively new, and it shows that Vietnam's trying to, thread the needle. They want to make data more accessible for, legitimate uses like R&D, but at the same time, they want to crack down on the illegal data trade.
Interesting. So they want to encourage data sharing for good, but also put up some guardrails to prevent it from being misused. I'm really curious to see how this plays out in practice. But before we get to that, let's talk about another big piece of this. Mandatory data sharing with government authorities. This has been a point of concern for some businesses.
For sure. The draft decrees do allow government authorities to request data from businesses, but it's not a free-for-all. They are encouraging voluntary data sharing for things like, public health advancements or, fighting climate change. And there are very specific conditions for mandatory requests.
Okay, so what are those conditions? What kind of safeguards are in place to protect businesses from, unreasonable demands?
So any data request has to be documented. It has to have a clear legal basis, a specific purpose, and time limitations. Businesses also have the right to modify or withdraw their data before the deadline.
It's good to hear. It sounds like they're trying to strike a balance
Right.
between, the need for data access and the rights of businesses. So how do you think all of this is going to impact businesses in Vietnam?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Yeah, it's a balancing act for sure. On the one hand, Vietnam is tightening its grip on data, especially sensitive data. And that means businesses need to be, much more careful about compliance.
Yeah, no doubt. But could this actually end up being a good thing for businesses? I mean, if this leads to a more stable and transparent data environment, wouldn't that be beneficial in the long run?
Absolutely. Increased trust and confidence in the system could attract more investment and foster innovation. And we can't forget about the potential for better data accessibility, especially for research and development.
And here's what I find really interesting. These draft decrees aren't set in stone yet. They're open for public consultation until, like, mid-March 2025.
Mm.
So businesses actually have a say in shaping these regulations.
Yeah, this is a huge opportunity. Businesses need to be proactive, figure out how these rules will affect them and make their voices heard through, industry discussions and feedback.
So it's not just about adapting, it's about helping to shape the rules. Okay, so let's zoom out for a minute. What does all of this tell us about, Vietnam's ambitions in the global digital economy? I mean, this push for stronger data governance.
It's a clear sign that Vietnam wants to be a major player in the digital world. They're building this robust legal framework, investing in infrastructure like the National Data Center, and prioritizing data security.
And you know what? While some people are worried about these stricter controls, couldn't this also help level the playing field? Maybe it'll actually attract international businesses that, value a predictable and secure data environment.
Absolutely. A well-regulated data landscape can be a competitive advantage, especially, as concerns about data privacy and security keep growing globally. Think about it. In a world where data breaches and privacy violations are constantly making headlines, businesses are looking for partners they can trust. And if Vietnam can demonstrate a real commitment to data security and, responsible data management,
Hmm.
that becomes a huge selling point. It's almost like a quality assurance stamp for the digital age.
Right. And for companies that are already dealing with strict data regulations in their own countries, Vietnam's robust framework could actually make operating there easier.
Exactly. It could really streamline compliance and reduce uncertainty. But of course, the big question is, how will these regulations actually be implemented? Will the process be clear, efficient, and consistent? Will there be enough flexibility to, keep up with the rapid pace of technological change? I mean, those are questions we can only answer over time. Right.
Exactly. Which is why it's so important for businesses to stay informed.
Yeah.
Keep monitoring the situation
Huh.
and adjust their strategies accordingly. This isn't like a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process.
Exactly. It really requires vigilance and proactive engagement.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about what businesses need to do, but let's shift gears for a second and talk about the potential impact on, everyday Vietnamese people.
Ah.
How do you think these data regulations are going to affect their lives?
That's a great question, and it's one that I think deserves a lot more attention. On the surface, stricter data protection measures could be seen as a positive step towards, safeguarding individual privacy. But, there's always a potential downside. Like, if the government's control over data gets too strong, it could end up, stifling innovation and even, limiting freedom of expression. So it's a delicate balance.
Yeah, for sure. It's like that classic trade-off between security and freedom, right?
Yeah.
Tough to get that just right. But on the business side of things, do you think this push for stronger data governance, will it actually make Vietnam more competitive in the global digital economy?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a calculated risk. There's definitely a chance that all these new regulations could create hurdles for businesses and maybe slow down innovation. But on the flip side, there's also the potential for Vietnam to position itself, as kind of a trusted and reliable hub for data-driven businesses.
Okay, so it's a gamble. But what are the potential upsides?
Well, think about it this way. In a world where, data breaches and privacy violations are constantly in the news, businesses are increasingly looking for partners they can trust, right? So if Vietnam can really demonstrate a commitment to data security and, responsible data management, that could become a huge selling point.
It's almost like a quality assurance stamp for the digital age, like data handled with care in Vietnam.
Exactly. And, for those international businesses
Mhm.
that are already dealing with strict data regulations in their home countries, Vietnam's framework might actually make it easier for them to operate there.
Yeah. It could streamline compliance and
Mhm.
just reduce a lot of the uncertainty.
Right. But of course, a lot will depend on how these regulations are implemented in practice. Will the process be clear and efficient and consistent? Will there be enough flexibility to accommodate, the rapid pace of technological change? I mean, these are all questions that we can only really answer over time.
Which is why it's so important for businesses to stay engaged, right?
Yeah.
Monitor the situation
Yeah.
and be ready to adapt their strategies as needed.
Absolutely. This is definitely not a set it and forget it kind of thing.
Right.
It's an ongoing process. It requires, vigilance and proactive engagement.
Well said. Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive
Hmm.
into Vietnam's evolving data regulations.
It's been a fascinating conversation. And, it's such a complex topic. We've only just scratched the surface, really.
But hopefully, we've given our listeners a good foundation for understanding the key issues and, the potential implications for their businesses.
Yeah. And maybe even sparked some ideas for how they can, proactively navigate this new landscape.
Exactly. Well, thanks for tuning in to the Compliance Officer's Playbook podcast. If you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And for those of you who really love the show and want even more in-depth analysis, become a paid subscriber today for just $4.99. You'll get full access to all of our premium episodes, packed with insights, stories, and value you won't find anywhere else. The link to subscribe is in the show notes.